Honored to be considered a part of the faculty of this great institution, whose renown is international. And it is a pleasure indeed to be part of this society to join you all. Thank you. I'm very appreciative of the complimentary remarks that have been made about me, and of course, especially about my being permitted to join the faculty of this great institution. Let me turn to the topic at hand, which is information considered as an economic commodity. There are many aspects of this matter which cannot be wrapped up in a single lecture, but I want to at least promote the issues involved. This lecture is intended as a catalog of questions and viewpoints. Am I registering now? This lecture is intended as a catalog of questions and viewpoints, raising some serious problems with the concepts supplied by standard economic theory. I don't promise to give much in the way of interesting answers. Instead, one interpretation of what I had to say is, to some extent, there cannot be any fully definite theory of economic behavior. Specifically, I want to argue that the role of information in the economy is essential to our understanding of its workings. By itself, this proposition might be so self-evident that it is not worth discussing. However, I want to argue that the process of acquiring information is more complex than is usually understood. As a result, the consequences for the economy are much different than the standard picture of economic theory. This approach may suggest some explanation of the occasionally erratic behavior of the modern economic system, which has been observed for the last 2 centuries or more. Let me expand on that a minute, that's not the text. One thing, indeed, I learned even as a graduate student, when I say graduate student, I'm talking about something probably beyond the birth of your parents. When I was a graduate student in economics in 1940 to 42, and we were in the middle of the Great Depression, at least until the war came. And the subject, what was called then business cycles, the term which is still used, was very, very prominent, shall I say. In particular, the university to which I went, to Columbia, was especially emphatic on this point. What we find is that over many, right from certainly right after the Napoleonic Wars, we began to have, I think it was in 1819, a sudden cessation of trade. People were unemployed. The phenomenon that we recognized today. This really is something unheard of in previous economic systems. That every now and then is applied. Indeed, if you read what was the standard work in economics of the middle of the 19th century, John Stuart Mill's Principles of Political Economy, there's a chapter called Commercial Crises. That was a term that was much used. And the description of what happens when the financial system collapses looks very modern. The particular forms it takes, of course, are very different. The banking structure is different, securities are different, but the story looks remarkably familiar. You doubtless all know that I've devoted a considerable part of my career as an economist to the elaboration of the general equilibrium approach to the understanding of the economy. One question that was much discussed when I was a beginner was the incorporation of uncertainty in the general equilibrium theory. I was very proud that I developed a formula which accomplished that. The economic agents in my model take account of the possible random events in advance. They don't know what's going to happen, but they know that this or this will happen. And know what will happen under each possible realization. Hence, news will affect the markets, of course, you find it. But it cannot cause a runaway reaction. I seem then to be repudiating a good part of my life's work. Actually, I was always aware of some issues, and a careful reading of my papers will show reservations and caveats. I don't intend this lecture to be a defense of myself, but I make a few remarks explaining my past thinking. What I want to stress in this lecture is that information is endogenous to the economic system. The information comes in many shapes and forms, but two important things can be said. One is that it plays an essential role in directing the allocation of resources, above and beyond the role of prices of the usual commodities. Two, it, as the information, is itself a commodity, being both scarce and valuable. But it has properties quite different from the usual. The special properties of information make the usual modeling of allocation through a market of limited use. My approach will be to start with the standard approach of economic theory. I assume that consumers are rational with regard to consumption, but especially with regard to risk bearing. Firms maximize profits, although that term requires definition in the context of uncertainty. There are markets, at least until they prove to be difficult or impossible to create. The market's clear at some appropriate times. But I'll start with that and see what goes wrong. As we shall see, the program leads to some conclusions, but also deep difficulties. It is these that we want to emphasize. Given this background, I want to introduce information as an explicit economic variable, subject to the same motivations as other economic choices, but the peculiarities of information as a commodity are stressed. To introduce the subject and to show its significance, I will review the different ways in which information affects the economic system. The second part is called Roles of Information in the Economic System. That information is important to the economy might seem to be self-evident. Ever since the work of Robert Solow, it has been evident that economic progress has been propelled for the most part by increases in knowledge, what we think of as technological progress. This is information by the transformation of goods from one form to another. In the usual neoclassical system, these are embodied in the production possibilities section. In the simplest version, this change takes place exogenously, usually represented by an exponential factor in some part of the model. You must all be acquainted with growth models of this kind. Of course, but I must add as a footnote, exponential growth forever is not possible. But it could conceivably be an approximation. Even in this simple account, there is, or at least there ought to be, complications. Technical change, after all, occurs in specific industries. maybe the steel industry, it may be the information industries, and what I don't know. I might, but then this will change relative prices. If I am considering investing in that industry, I might postpone the investment to take advantage of a superior process in the future. I might worry that a competitive product will become cheaper, and so I do not invest in it. In short, anticipating technical progress will have effects on current economic behavior. The second and even more obvious complication is that technological change doesn't just happen. It is the result of a decision to seek it, and it is costly. There is sometimes a tendency to regard technological change as a byproduct of scientific research, itself not directed to a particular technology, and so to be sort of exogenous. Even if this were an adequate formulation of science, which it is not, there is still a large expenditure on research and development needed to achieve viable and useful alterations of technology. There is another issue, clearly of great importance in understanding economic history and economic development. This is the question of the diffusion of knowledge. It is clear that just as production functions differ over time, they also differ among countries and even regions at a given moment of time. In fact, they differ considerably among firms in a single country. This differentiation, that diffusion is not instantaneous, requires explanation. There are undoubtedly many factors here, but surely one is the idea of intellectual property. New productive ideas are often owned. But this is not really compatible with the view that technological progress is exogenous. It means that a firm owns an idea because it has invested in it. There's also a second factor in this slowness of diffusion. Acquiring already existing information is itself costly. This point should be obvious to any professor watching his or her students expending considerable effort in understanding the problems involved, and understanding the course material. And of course, the professors should remember their student days. We already, in fact, reading somebody else's paper involves considerable effort of time and mind. We already see some lessons for the economics of information. One, the information an individual has is a matter of choice, not a given. Two, information is itself costly. Three, information is not only about the natural world and its laws, but also about the actions of others. The actions of others, in turn, depend on their information. Most other kinds of information found in the economic system are even more clearly information about others within the economic system. The financial sector, now greatly expanded in size, is essentially an industry based on collecting information about the parts of the economy and acting on that information. The actions include the purchases and sales of securities, but are not confined to what are ordinarily thought of as markets. They also include two-party contracts, such as extension of credit to firms, commercial credit, and to individuals, personal loans and mortgages, real estate. The The circular nature of information in the market was given explicit recognition by Oscar Morgenstern in a paper in 1934. This was before his joint work with John von Neumann on game theory. He had been concerned with business cycle forecasting, because he was the head of the Austrian Business Cycle Research Institute. He began to question whether forecasting was possible by recognizing, as what we have already observed, that in effect, individuals are forecasting each other's forecasts. About the same time, 1936, John Maynard Keynes, in the General Theory of Employment and Interest of Money, likened the capital markets to an advertising campaign which had been run by an American brewer. The advertisements contained the pictures of 6 fashion models, and each participant was to choose one. The participant got a prize if his or her choice got the most votes. Clearly, the participant should choose not the one that he or she thinks is the prettiest, but the one that he thinks other people think is the prettiest. Of course, you start going up that, but clearly, this process leads to an infinite regress. And Keynes's point is really much the same as Morgenstern's. Rational forecasts of circular. By the way, what Keynes drew from this was it's just sort of chaotic, nothing that you don't know what's going to happen. Either things can change, and therefore investments are subject to deep uncertainty. That was the point he was making. When you have such a process determining the allocation or the amount invested, then there's going to be a lot of instability. Of course, mutual dependence, which is all I've said so far, is forecasting mutual dependence, does not mean the failure of the system. The standard theory of general equilibrium is therefore a theory of mutual dependence, and what many of us have shown is that it does have a consistent solution, or an equilibrium exists. I'll return to this question a little later. Part 3. A rational theory of information acquisition. That's that information can be acquired, not just given. One kind of behavior under uncertainty is the acquisition of information. If you think of uncertainty, the problem that you have is that you want to decide how much to invest, or whether to invest in this security or that security, portfolio diversification, things of that kind. But there's one more thing that you can do in the face of uncertainty, and to try to reduce it by acquiring information. Hence, a rational theory of information acquisition can be and has been deduced from the general theory of behavior under uncertainty. Third, just to state what you all know, rational behavior under uncertainty is usually modeled as follows. Individuals have some choice of actions, such as investment in various risky alternatives, which yield an uncertain outcome, say X. That is, the outcome depends on factors outside the control of the individual and about which they are uncertain. In the hypothesis of rational action says that individuals have a utility function, U of X, and they choose their actions to maximize the expected value of U of X. That's the theory which was set forth by Daniel Bernoulli in 1738, in a paper published in St. Petersburg. He was a court mathematician, and he proceeded to the Imperial Academy, which is a very famous paper. He explains, for example, the role of insurance. It's a very good passage on what we call green insurance against a ship sinking, and why, even though it's a person buying the insurance has a negative expected value, it still pays, because it overcomes it. It reduces the risk from the chip itself. I thought it was a very remarkable thing. It was not really assimilated into economics for 150 years. Diffusion is sometimes rather slow. What we must consider here is the acquisition of information as one of the actions the risk bearer might undertake. Might buy insurance, but one of the things is find out what the risk are. The bulk of our analysis on uncertainties has dealt with the purchase of securities under with random future prices and other uncertainties of payment, or the analysis of production with uncertain outcomes, like for example oil exploration, or devices to maintain consumption in the presence of random shocks to income and wealth. However, it has always been somewhat true that individuals facing uncertainty try to acquire more information about the uncertainty. The optimal choice of information has been studied especially by mathematical statisticians. A simple form is that of sampling. There's some parameter relevant to the individual's decisions, but unknown to it. The individual knows. This might be, for example, the mean return to the expected amount of security. We can make observations which are governed by a probability distribution dependent on that parameter. Thus, our uncertainty about the parameter after making the observations has changed, usually is reduced. We can formalize this change in uncertainty by the use of Bayes' theorem. Suppose our initial uncertainty about the mean return is represented by a probability distribution. That was uncertainty in its area of probability. Then after drawing the example, Bayes' theorem yields a new distribution, which we can call the posterior distribution. The distribution you had before your sample is called the prior. And then after drawing the sample, we have a new distribution of the posterior. This is the distribution to be employed in making optimal investment decisions once you're drawn. It's easy to show that in investing a given amount of money, it is always better to optimize given the posterior. But of course, sampling is itself, in general, costly. A statistical prototype is acceptance sampling. Supposing a firm orders a large number of items delivered. Now, some of them may be defective. Testing any item is costly. You don't want to test it. The firm takes a sample and then tests each one of those. It then makes a decision to accept or reject the entire lot, taking account of the posterior distribution of defects and the costs and benefits of accepting or rejecting the lot. One further decision is the size of the sample. The larger the sample, the lower the probability of you making a wrong decision, but also the higher the cost. Your economics. In terms of an investment portfolio, an individual may devote some of his or her initial wealth to research, then use the rest of the funds to invest on the basis of the posterior distribution. So you have the gains from the using the posterior distribution weighed against the cost of the sample together. You get the right, you can find an optimal sample. Hence, the investor has to allocate his funds among a number of alternative commodities, which include not only different securities, but also information. However, there is one special way in which the demand for information differs from the usual demand functions. The information is typically about the rate of return, that is, not the amount. Hence, its value to the investor depends on the amount invested in. If I invest a lot of money, it pays me to acquire information. If I invest a little bit of money, the benefit I get is very small. You expect that those with more wealth will buy more information, more wealth to invest, so that the rate of return, what they have invested, should, on the average, be higher. Whereas the people who have more to invest are going to buy more information, therefore they're going to do better in their allocation and their portfolio decisions, and therefore they should get a higher rate of return on the average. And this comes out in mathematics, and there is some evidence that this is true empirically. Richer people do get higher rates of return. This proposition certainly implies that individuals in the market face different distributions of returns, since they have different amounts of information. Now, there's also a question of where you go for your information. There are alternative sources. It follows that there is a trade-off between the quality of the information and its cost. It's not only the amount you sample, but what you sample. Investors may tend to use readily available information, such as transactions on observable markets, things that are reported regularly, rather than better but scarcer information. They may also tend to use information from those to whom they are close for non-economic reasons. What we call network effects. Very important in the labor market. For all these reasons, it is clear that the market will not reflect all the information available, and that the information used by different parties will be different. Now let's go to the market as information on the theories, the theoretical side. The market as it, as well, twice the market actually is. Let me turn to a significant strand of the economic literature in the last century. This is the idea, conveyed in several different forms, that market prices are themselves information. I've learned to tell you rather than prices. This is an idea which hovers between a metaphor and an expression of reality. An early expression is Adam Smith's reference to the invisible hand. I should say to you that historians of economic thought have debated extensively about Smith's meaning. The context of a particular passage where it occurs is a little odd, since that particular passage distinguishes sharply between domestic investment and foreign investment. I read the relevant passages very carefully, and I find the usual interpretation to be correct. He is saying people are guided to something which is nationally, socially efficient by the operation of prices. This has been disputed by serious authors, by the way, so not so self-evident. Each investor seeks out the most profitable investment. The result is to maximize or to increase national income. Clearly, the prices are being used as signals, but only really in a metaphorical sense. Each individual takes the prices as facts and does not analyze them as a statistical sample. In short, the invisible hand really merges into what we would call today welfare economics. It would appear that by a happy coincidence, competitive equilibrium is efficient in some sense only made clear by gradual developments in economic analysis, called Pareto efficiency. But remember, Pareto was writing like 125 years after Smith. First time he had a clear statement of what is even meant by efficiency. One aspect of the matter that came up earlier is the question of computation. However defined, competitive equilibrium is a matter of solving a quite complicated set of equations. Pareto, in fact, analogized the market to a computer. In fact, at least in the French translation of his major work, Manual of Political Economy, the word he uses for the market is ordinateur, which is the word that's used today in French to mean computer. I'm afraid the Italian is beyond me. But I can read French. Indeed, he extolled the market as being able to solve systems far beyond the capacities of the then current computing as in 1904, with computing and pencil and paper. The idea that prices might convey information in a more literal sense, as they actually be read as kind of a sample, seems to have started with the analysis of possible socialist systems. By the end of the 19th century, socialist parties had significant representation in European parliaments, and the prospect arose that socialism might be enacted through democratic processes. This raised the question how a socialist system would actually operate. Pareto, though himself an economic liberal and an anti-socialist, was interested in the question and encouraged a younger economist, Enrico Barone, to develop the model of a socialist system, a socialist economy. That's 1906. Here, the central ministry controls resources. Prices are announced, and the firms and household announce their demands and supplies at these prices. And prices are varied until supply equals demand. In many ways, Barone's paper contained all the essence of the later discussion, but it was unknown until it was rediscovered by Hayek. Discussion became a public issue just after the end of World War I, particularly in Austria, where the prospect of a socialist takeover appeared imminent. Ludwig von Mises argued that a socialist system was impossible. You needed to have prices to allocate resources. Joseph Schumpeter, whose position is usually so erratic that it doesn't fall into any of the usual categories, apparently disagreed. And he got a student, Claire Tisch, to explain how a price system could serve as signaling analysis, very similar to Barone's, but he didn't know anything about Barone. There followed then over the next 15 to 20 years a whole, 15 minutes, a whole flood of articles, that's all I can say. Frequently not even known to each other, so that people were rediscovering things. Repeating, extending, and clarifying the process. Friedrich von Hayek, of course, was on the side that it wasn't going to work. He was kind of the most famous, but Jacob Marshak, Fred Taylor, an American economist, not particularly famous, but he wasn't president of the American Economic Association. And actually, in the middle of the 1920s, very boom period, he wrote on the calculation in a socialist economy. He gave his presidential address on how to calculate the socialist economy. Why, I don't know. Why, I got this right around here. And of course, most famously, the Polish economist Oskar Lange. Must be mentioned. The basic issue began to be seen as a problem in computation and information costs. A centralized system, literally, would require that each firm transmit all its information to a central authority, presumably an impossibly costly operation. Market socialism tries to achieve an optimum by an iterative approach in which the only items of information transmitted were the supplies and demands for the successive price approximation. Now, the first person to fully formalize the issues, in my opinion, and gave an enormous clarification to the whole discussion, was the paper of Leonid Pervich, which was published in 1960. Herman Pervich, who died a year ago, was a very good friend of mine. I had some contact with von Mises and Hayek, but also with Lange. In particular, he emphasized what the key requirement implicit in the market socialism discovery, this discussion, what he called the privacy-preserving principle. Mainly, the only message, there's a set of rules, you set out messages. Each unit is supposed to receive messages, and then on the basis of the messages and the private information, send out messages. So the only thing that's transmitted is in a predefined message space. When the messages all agreed, you were in equilibrium and you carried time. The messages were from a limited set, as I said. And he showed, for example, that under the usual assumptions for competitive equilibrium, the price system, in some sense, I'm not going to try to reproduce this argument, was at least as efficient in informational terms, because the amount of information transmitted was as low as any other possible system. So the competitive equilibrium represented an efficient way of allocating resources. Information, efficient, not the usual sense of Pareto, but in addition, in terms of the amount of information that had to be transmitted. I had a particular definition of amount of information, I will go into that. So I talk about the market as information theory. So it was really, I think it was really the socialist controversy, as you know, that really gave this idea of the market as a whole, the market system as a whole, is an information device, in addition to whatever else it does. Now, I'm going to talk now, part 5, the market as information in practice. Let's turn to the question, to what extent can markets guide investment activity? The costs are incurred in the present, but the returns occur in the future. What are the relevant markets for investment activity? Well, really, there are very few. It's not like meat or clothing. There are, of course, securities markets. Here I include things like derivatives, complicated securities like derivatives. These are commitments to pay money in the future. They don't allocate specific goods, but they do allocate goods in general over time. But an interesting question arises. Why are there many transactions? When a person holds, buys a security, why don't they just hold it to maturity? I made a loan for 20 years, but I get interest in the years. You imagine each argument. Now, there has to be some difference between the buyer and the seller. Otherwise, why would there be a transaction? Now, part of it, of course, is there are natural ones. People, let's say, have different parts of their life cycle. Both people who are selling their securities to retire, young people who are saving for the future, that sort of thing. Or some people need cash for some other purpose, and this investment is a new investment. But it's quite clear that most transactions don't take place for those reasons. They're due to differences in expectations. People have, which corresponds to a point already made, that people have different information. Let's look at some examples. Let's start with the weak futures market. I picked up in the course of my reading a few great cases where on the analysis of these markets. And they don't really conform. They differ in different ways from the results that the standard theory that I sketched before would predict. The weak futures market is about as well organized a market that one is likely to find. Not a really very good, well-organized market. You can buy, you can be sure of delivery, all sorts of things of that kind. Yet its behavior accords only in part with the basic theories about the markets. The wheat is largely purchased by millers in order to make flour. The standard account says that the risk-averting millers want to buy wheat in advance for delivery at harvest time. So they do so to avoid uncertainty in the price they pay. Like most people who buy insurance, they expect to lose money on the average. They are buying price uncertainty at a price. It is then expected that speculators who sell the futures will profit. What they do is they buy the crop as it comes to market, and then they cover their obligation. So their profit is the difference between the price at time of harvest, the current price, and the price they are sold in advance. They presumably participate on the basis of some kind of expected profit, and a profit large enough to cover their risk. A detailed study shows that millers did indeed lose just as predicted. So that's fine. But speculators turn out to fell into two categories. One of them are the people who are actually brokers in the market, but also trade on their own account. Knowledgeable people. They made money. But the money they made was roughly the annual, the salary they might have earned in some other occupation, like being a vice president of a bank. The other group are outsiders, people who are not brokers. They lost money on the average. Now, how do we explain then why outside speculators measure at all? They take risks. They should make a profit. They actually make a loss. So clearly the information available to them was defective. They didn't realize that outside speculators lose money. The deviations from theory in other futures markets are much more dramatic than in wheat, which is, as I say, a very well-behaved market. Consider, example, the market for foreign exchange. The usual explanation for buying foreign exchange is that international sales are not delivered instantaneously. It may be some time before delivery is made and payment is made. The foreign exchange, for example, say ruble-dollar, may change during the intervening period. And the seller may want to hedge against this uncertainty. This would imply that the demand for foreign exchange in a year ought to be roughly equal to the world trade, compared to each transaction hedged. In fact, the transactions are about 300 times greater. Transactions in a day are about equal to the world trade in a year. Clearly, most of the transactions are between people who have no legitimate hedging interests. Instead, these markets are used essentially for betting among people with different expectations and beliefs. Still another example where the behavior of a future-oriented market departs from standard economic theory is the behavior of the standard stock market. In theory, the price of a stock should be the discounted value of its dividends adjusted for risk. Now that is the summary of a very long future. So it's based on things about which the knowledge isn't going to change very much. It changes what's going to happen 2 years from now, what's going to happen 5 years from now. You don't expect that our prediction, what's going to happen 2 years from now, to change very much from today to tomorrow. Yet a change in the aggregate stock market interest, the aggregate index, smoothing out all differences between industries. The stock market, the aggregate stock market index, changes 1% to 2% in one day. That's normal. That happens all the time. It's not something extraordinary. How could the discounted value over a long time change by 1%? What does anybody learn? There's something wrong. It doesn't correspond. Again, this implies that the information sets underlying the market price are remarkably unstable. The behavior of the securities market and the markets and other credit transactions in the current crisis hardly suggests very good responsiveness to information. Indeed, even earlier, there was an incident which should have given warning. In 1998, a very successful hedge fund found itself in trouble. This fund, particularly, a fund operated by investing its clients' money to arbitrage some quite small deviations from a normal relation. As you see, you expect certain prices to be normal related. They're a little off, so they're going to come back. The deviations were so small that they would yield very little profit if one of the investors only invested their own money. So they borrowed money. In fact, the fund was borrowing 97% of the amount it invested. Only 3% was in fact put up by clients. When the returns fell somewhat short, they were temporarily unable to repay. Now, that so far is straightforward. The amount borrowed, however, was so great that their creditors, and even the Federal Reserve Board, saw it as a threat to the safety of the creditors, and therefore to the financial institution, financial system as a whole. It's the behavior of the lenders that's difficult to understand. They had a lot at stake, so much that their safety was threatened. And they were experts in understanding this. This is not the usual story of poor people knowing very little and getting into a risky statement that they don't understand. These were people who knew as much as anybody could know. Maybe they're also ignorant people, but at least they know as much as anybody could possibly know. So they had a lot of money, and also they had a lot of money at stake, so it paid them to acquire, to study the situation carefully, to acquire a lot of information. Of course, they have had only favorable experiences with this fund. And this was part of their information set. This LTCM, as it's supposed to call long-term capital management, have done remarkably well, returning 30–40% a year for many years. So the banks said that's part of the information they were using. This particular situation was ultimately resolved with very little loss, except to the fund itself. The fund itself went out of business. The favorable outcome may have been unfortunate in building up to a lack of concern on the greater speculation that followed. Some people think it should have allowed it to fail. That would have been a warning, because avoiding moral hazard. So there was a much greater speculation that followed based on mortgage-backed securities. And again, the financial sector proved unable to assemble the information to cause caution on the part of the market. The underlying facts were clear enough. The ultimate source of value was the housing market, where prices were rising rapidly. There were many comments in the financial press on the possible unsustainability of this rise. So it's not as though nobody knew about it. There were articles about how could this continue. There were many. So the financial sector should have at least recognized the uncertainty of the situation and curtailed its willingness to invest. Similarly, the markets and the credit system seem to have been unable to anticipate the problems with Greek debt. Again, why didn't these banks with all their analysts realize? It's true that the Greek government concealed the matter, but why didn't they add up what's going on and say there must be something going on here? And why did they say, well, we'll lay off the bonds, which means the interest rate would have risen, which would have caused the Greek government, forced them to take some action before. So it's hard to believe that. Okay. Part 6. General equilibrium. I'm keeping on shifting back and forth from practical problems, the implications for theories. General equilibrium with markers for future uncertainty. In the final section of my talk here, I want to review briefly the general equilibrium theory for allocation over time under uncertainty. I want to re-examine why the markets called for in the theory do not exist, and what are the implications for economic behaviors of their failure to exist. Eric Lindahl seems to be the first one to note that capital theory could be regarded as ordinary value and equilibrium theory with commodities that are given dates. So that steel delivered next year is a different commodity from steel delivered today. The equilibrium means that the market for each commodity at each date clears. Lindahl first published his ideas in Swedish in 1929. Not a very good idea to disseminate, but it was translated in English in 1939. At the same time, John R. Hicks came up with a similar approach to capital theory, but it was embedded in a much more sophisticated and more fundamentally based theory of firm and consumer behavior. It turned out that a parallel construction can introduce uncertainty to general equilibrium theory. I follow the general approach to probability theory set forth, say, by Kolmogorov. We refer to a state of nature as a complete description of the world, or at least the parts relevant to it. Uncertainty, then, is represented by a probability distribution over these states of nature. We can then identify commodities, not only by date, but by the state of nature. And say the price of a house on the beach is conditional on whether a hurricane occurred. A strong storm occurred, would be an example. A typical market transaction would be to deliver a physically described commodity at a given date if a given state of nature occurs. I proposed this construction in a paper in 1952 and is subsequently considerably deepened by Gerard de Breu in 1959. Clearly, however, this extremely rich set of markets is very far from reality. As you've already seen, only a few such markets exist. And so, since a market should emerge, if there are any mutual gains from its creation, we have to ask why this should be. I will return to one explanation in a minute. We must also ask what the implications of a market failure are. We've already seen them. They create a need for forecasting with all the problems already sketched. If markets for all future dates and for all risks existed, then the prices at which these transactions will take place is known, and no further information will be of any use. It is the market failure that makes information seeking so important. We must observe that to have a general equilibrium which handles time and uncertainty there are some hidden informational assumptions. Consider, for example, the simplest market for equilibrium over time, where there is private preserving in the Herbert's sense. Suppose each individual has no, this is about as simple a model as you can get. Suppose each individual has no uncertainty about his or her future income. However, some individuals really wish to modify the time stream of consumption from that of income. They're buying things at a certain point in life, and they'd rather have the consumption, keep their consumption up another time when that income is gone. Let's say you got some two periods. They wish when they want, say, to lend in period 1 and then consume more in period 2. In total, period 2 income plus the repayment with interest of the loan. This sounds pretty straightforward. But how do we know, even in the simplest case, that the borrower can or will desire to repay? To be sure, we can impose some penalty, as to say, regarding the borrower as bankruptcy. But the borrower may prefer this outcome, having consumed a great deal in period 1. Hence, even if all the relevant markets existed, it would be valuable to acquire information. In this case, information about the borrower. The lender wants to acquire information about the borrower, which is, of course, what a bank does. Banks classically have had a main part of their business investigating the creditworthiness of those it considers lending to. It's also true that uncertainty in informational problems can prevent markets from emerging. Consider the contingent market defined earlier. There's a market which says you pay off, you make such and such a delivery or you pay money conditional on the state of nature. For this to exist, it's necessary that all the parties understand what state of nature has occurred. Because I don't know what's happened. This is a condition on the information held by the economic agents involved. We come to one of the most important developments in economic theory in the last 60 years, the recognition that individuals hold different information. The term asymmetric information has been coined and includes such well-known phenomena as moral hazard and adverse selection. This concept is very important to understand in a number of different fields, especially those where the commodity dealt with includes a good deal of information. Medical practice and insurance and financial services are two good examples. Clearly, you go to the doctor because he knows something different than you know. The failure of the market to operate too well in this circumstance has led to a literature usually called mechanism design, on creating incentives, usually within firms, to achieve some improvement. Finally, associated with these modifications of general equilibrium theory, I must return once more to the acquisition of information. Suppose first that each individual has a little bit of information. Price emerges, it reflects everybody's information. This price thus conveys something about everyone else's information. I have some views, I find this price is not what I expect, because I say, well, the other people must know this and this in order for that to be true. One continues, so then I say, not only do I use my information, but I use the information from the price, and then I can improve. Well, this process can iterate until you come to some kind of equilibrium. And this approach has been developed by a number of authors. Suppose, so there are problems with this, but I don't want to go into that. But the problem this starts with people having given information. Suppose the information is not initially given to the agent in the market, but they have to choose it at a price. They may choose to acquire some, and so start the process. But as Grossman and Stiglitz have pointed out, if the price becomes highly informative, then it doesn't pay any individual agent to acquire the information. The price, everybody else has looked into this matter. The price reflects all the information I conceive and want. I won't bother to pay for the information. But if everybody reasons that way, it doesn't pay any particular agent to acquire the information. But if no one acquires the information, then it never enters the market price, which is therefore uninformative, and therefore pays quite a bit. There's a real contradiction, there's a fundamental contradiction in that process, as Grossman and Stiglitz pointed out. Finally, part 7, multiple sources of information. We have seen the extreme importance of information in guiding the economic system in view of the absence of adequate prices for the future and for risky events. Let me just make a few simple remarks designed to emphasize the possibility that changes in information and belief may play a major role in the rather sudden and radical alterations in economic activity to which the capitalist system has been subject since its rise to dominance. My first remark is that information, although it is a commodity, valuable and scarce, it's valuable and it's useful, well, it's valuable and costly. It has very different properties from ordinary commodities. It can be used or sold, but it remains in existence and in the hands of the original owner. I didn't mention here, it can be used over and over again by the original owner too. It's a key point. Once I know how to make something, I can use that same information over and over again. I also can sell it, but I've still got it. However, hence the smooth reactions you usually expect in well-running markets may fail. Second, getting information is very subtle. Essentially, we make inferences about the inferences made by others. Even seeing that someone will, just the mere fact of seeing that someone will buy at the price I offer to sell tells me something about his information. If he's willing to buy, if I offer to sell, he's willing to buy. He must know something that I don't know, and vice versa. We're quickly led to infinite regressions. There's no necessary contradiction, but the reasoning processes may not be capable of being carried out, so we stop short. Reasoning is a costly enterprise. You consider a mathematical proof consists of a number of steps. If it was infinitely easy to get zero cost to carry out, all of mathematics would have been mere factors of making reasoning, of trying to make sense out of the world. Must necessarily involve, at any finite time, must only involve a finite number of steps. You can't get
true theories or true conclusions. All these characteristics suggest the possibility of excessive reaction to a minor change in information. Well, I know I haven't answered my questions, but I hope some of you will be stimulated to think further on the role of information in the economic system.
Я хочу сообщить, что профессор любезно согласился, что этот текст был переведен, и он будет опубликован в экономическом журнале Высшей школы экономики. Значит, как статья в ближайшее время. Теперь вопрос.